He walked through the door of the Sagrada Familia just as the evening light turned amber over Barcelona. The crowds outside numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Inside, 8,000 people fell into complete silence, and Pope Leo XIV, the first American-born pope in the history of the Church, stood still for a long moment at the threshold of a cathedral that had been under construction for 144 years, and looked up. There was nothing rehearsed about that pause. Witnesses described it as the silence of a man who understands the weight of what he is standing in front of. He looked up into the vaulting stone, and for a moment the ceremony waited. Take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. The stories we tell here matter, and knowing you are with us matters more than you know. Because what happened on the evening of June 10, 2026, was not simply a papal ceremony. It was the closing of a wound the Catholic world had carried for more than a century. It was the fulfillment of a promise made in stone, in faith, in suffering, and in the life of a man who gave everything to a church he knew. With absolute certainty, he would never live to see finished. This is the story of the Sagrada Familia. On the 19th of March in 1882, on the feast of St. Joseph, a groundbreaking ceremony took place on what was then the northern outskirts of Barcelona. The land had been purchased by the Spiritual Association of Devotees of St. Joseph, a lay organization of devout Catalan Catholics with the dream of building a great expiatory church dedicated to the Holy Family. The architect commissioned was Francisco de Paula del Villar. His plan was modest, a Gothic revival church in the classical tradition, nothing that would set Barcelona apart from any other cathedral city. Work began. The crypt was started. Within a year, del Villar had resigned over a technical disagreement about crypt drainage. A new architect was needed. What happened next changed the history of architecture and the history of the Catholic Church in Spain forever. Antoni Gaudi was 30 years old when the building committee handed him the project. He had been born in 1852 in the town of Reus in Catalonia, the son of a coppersmith, and had grown up watching craftsmen work with metal, learning from an early age to see the logic inside physical materials. He studied architecture in Barcelona and graduated in 1878. His early work showed unusual gifts and unusual devotion. But more important than his talent was his faith. By the time he took over the Sagrada Familia, he was a man of profound Catholic conviction. He was not designing a monument. He was building what he believed, in the most literal sense, was a house of God. A space where the parabolas of soap bubbles, the branching geometry of trees, the spiraling forms of seashells, all of it would be translated into stone and offered back to the Creator who had invented it. He tore up del Villar's plans and started again, and so began one of the longest and most spiritually costly building projects in the history of Christianity. Gaudi would work on the Sagrada Familia for more than 40 years. He turned down other commissions. He withdrew from Barcelona's social world. He moved into a workshop on the building site. Those who knew him in his final decades describe a man who prayed the rosary every day, attended daily mass, fasted with a severity that alarmed his friends, and lived with a simplicity that bordered on destitution. He was, in the eyes of those who loved him, a mystic disguised as an architect. He spoke of the building as his client. He said that he was not in any hurry with the Sagrada Familia because his client, God, was not in a hurry either. On the 7th of June 1926, Gaudi took his usual afternoon walk through the streets of Barcelona toward the church of Sant Felip Neri. He walked along the Gran Via, dressed as he always was in his old and worn clothes. A tram struck him as he crossed the road. He lay on the pavement, bleeding from a head wound. The people who passed assumed he was a beggar. No one recognized him. By the time the chaplain of the Sagrada Familia identified his face, His condition had deteriorated beyond recovery. He died on the 10th of June, 1926. He was 73 years old. His funeral drew an enormous crowd through the streets of Barcelona. He was buried, at his own request, in the crypt of the church he had devoted his life to building, in the chapel of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, beneath the floor, beneath the foundations of the great central spire he had designed but would never see rise. 100 years later, to the exact day, Pope Leo XIV stood in that same basilica and inaugurated the Tower of Jesus Christ. To understand what that moment meant, you have to hold in your mind what Gaudi had planned from the beginning. He designed the Sagrada Familia as a complete symbolic universe in stone, a church that would tell the entire story of the Christian faith to anyone who walked around it. 18 towers in all, 12 representing the 12 apostles, 4 representing the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 1 tower dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and at the center, rising higher than all the others, the Tower of Jesus Christ, the stone declaration that Christ is above all things. Gaudi designed the Tower of Jesus Christ to reach 172.5 meters. He made one crucial choice that reveals everything about his theology. The tower would be slightly lower than the hill of Montjuic, the natural hill that overlooks the city. Human construction, however magnificent, should never exceed what God has already made. For generations, that central tower existed only in drawings. Visitors came to photograph the Nativity facade and then look toward the center and see cranes. Scaffolding, the obvious fact of incompletion. In 1936, anarchist forces entered the crypt and burned Gaudi's workshop, destroying a significant portion of his original models and plans. The architects who came after spent years reconstructing what had been lost, working from photographs and fragments and the logic of Gaudi's geometric system. Construction continued through the mid-20th century and accelerated as computer-aided design transformed what could be built. By the time Pope Benedict XVI arrived in Barcelona in November 2010, the nave was complete and the church was beginning to look like the full form Gaudi had imagined. On the 7th of November 2010, Benedict consecrated the basilica as a minor basilica of the Catholic Church. He stood beneath the branching stone columns that Gaudi had designed to look like trees in a sacred forest. Light falling through the stained glass in pools of amber and blue and gold. And he spoke of the Sagrada Familia as a place where the living stones of the church's people came together under a vaulted heaven made by human hands as an act of praise. After Benedict's visit, construction accelerated. On the 20th of February 2026, the final piece of the Tower of Jesus Christ was installed, the upper arm of the Great Cross at its summit. For the first time in 144 years of construction, the Sagrada Familia had reached its full intended height. The cross at the apex of the central tower was visible from across the city. The completion was announced for June 2026, the centenary year of Gaudi's death. Now we must speak about who walked through those doors on the evening of June 10, 2026. Pope Leo XIV was born Robert Francis Prevost in Chicago, Illinois, on September 14, 1955. He studied mathematics and philosophy at Villanova University, entered the novitiate of the Order of St. Augustine in 1977, and was ordained a priest in Rome on June 19, 1982. He then did something few future popes have done. He went to live and work among the poor. The Augustinian mission in Chulucanas, in the Piura region of northern Peru, received him in 1985. He returned to Peru in 1988 and spent years there in mission. He served as Prior General of the Augustinians from 2001 to 2013, then returned to Peru as Bishop of Chiclayo, a bishop known for being present among his people, who did not govern from a distance. When Pope Francis died on April 21, 2025, the cardinals gathered in conclave knowing they needed a successor for a church in a complex moment. They chose Prevost. The white smoke rose on May 8, 2025. He took the name Leo. And here is the detail that those who know church history noticed immediately. The construction of the Sagrada Familia began in 1882 under the pontificate of Pope Leo X. The cornerstone of Gaudi's great church was laid under a Leo. 144 years later, 1882 plus 144 equals 2026. It was a Leo who would inaugurate its completion. The morning of June 10, 2026 began not in Barcelona, but at the monastery of Montserrat, perched on its extraordinary crag of serrated rock, 48 kilometers north of the city. At its heart is the Chapel of the Black Madonna, the ancient polychrome statue of the Virgin Mary, venerated there since the 9th century. Saints have knelt before that Madonna. Ignatius of Loyola came to Montserrat in 1522 and spent a night in vigil before the statue before laying down his sword and beginning the journey that would lead him to found the Society of Jesus. On the morning of the centenary of Gaudi's death, Pope Leo XIV spent time in prayer before that same Madonna. Then he descended from the mountain and traveled to Barcelona. The streets around the basilica had been closed for hours. Pilgrims filled every available space, holding rosaries, holding flags, holding the hands of the people beside them. At 7:30 in the evening, Pope Leo XIV entered the basilica. What those inside experienced defies easy description. Gaudi designed the interior with an obsessive attention to light. He oriented the building so the western light pours through warm-colored glass in the evening, ambers and reds and deep golds that flood the stone, columns in a way that seems to come from within the stone itself. At 7:30 on the 10th of June, the light in the Sagrada Familia was at the height of its evening drama. The columns of the nave branch as they rise, like trees in an ancient forest, splitting and spreading until they reach the vaulted ceiling and form a stone canopy of geometric complexity. 8,000 people stood in silence beneath that canopy as the Pope came in. The choirs of San Jordi, the Escalania de Montserrat, and the Orfeo Catala gathered as they had gathered for Benedict XVI in 2010, and their voices rose into the stone architecture and became something more than music. Pope Leo XIV celebrated the solemn Mass, surrounded by cardinals, bishops, and priests from across the church, and at the end of the Mass, he performed the blessing and inauguration of the Tower of Jesus Christ. In his homily, according to those present, he spoke of what this building had cost. Not in money, though the cost in money over 144 years had been sustained entirely by private donations, not a single euro of public funding. The church built purely on the gifts of the faithful. He spoke of what it had cost in human terms, the dedication of a man who gave up everything to stand on a building site and draw and pray and supervise the cutting of stone until a tram took him from the world. The patience of architects who came after and worked from fragments to reconstruct what fire had taken. The generations of the faithful who gave money and prayer to a church they knew, statistically, they would not live to see completed. He spoke of Gaudi as a man of faith, not merely a historical figure. Gaudi's cause for beatification was formally opened in 1998. The investigation into his life and virtues has continued for more than a quarter century, and many who know his story believe the title of blessed, and perhaps eventually saint, is one he has already earned. What witnesses report is that he spoke of the peculiar grace of being the person who arrives at the end of a long labor and is allowed to close the circle. He was that person, a Leo completing what a Leo had begun, a missionary from Peru standing over the grave of a mystic from Rios. The completion of the Tower of Jesus Christ made the Sagrada Familia the tallest Catholic church on earth, 172.5 meters, surpassing even the Basilica of Our Lady of Peace in Yamoussoukro in Ivory Coast, which had previously held that distinction. For those inside that evening, the architectural record was secondary. What mattered was the declaration, the highest point of the Barcelona skyline, built by human hands, dedicated not to any state or commercial enterprise, but to Jesus Christ. Gaudi is buried in the chapel of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, directly beneath the floor of the basilica where the Pope stood. The 10th of June was the 100th anniversary of the day Gaudi died. These facts are simply true. They were not arranged by anyone. They arrived in the order that history arranged them. One stone laid after another, one year following the next, until the story found its completion on the day it was always going to find it. For the faithful watching on screens in Peru, and in Chicago, and in Madrid, and in Manila, and in the villages and the hospital rooms where Catholics around the world encountered this moment, what they saw was something they will carry for the rest of their lives, a century of faith vindicated, a dream that outlasted the dreamer, a church that survived anarchist fire and civil war, and the destruction of its original plans, and the long, grinding patience of 100 years, and still rose, the cross at its apex visible from across Barcelona, not lower than the hill that God made, but higher than anything else that men had built in that city by the sea. Gaudi said he was not in a hurry, because his client was not in a hurry. 144 years later, the client accepted the work. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves the church. We will keep telling these stories as long as you are here to hear them.